Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming and participating to our Advanced Studies Seminar of the Institute for Philosophical Studies of University of Coimbra, Portugal. This seminar focuses on the Conimbricenses in a broad sense and takes place as a learning platform for a small group of PhD students from University of Coimbra or junior researchers. Some of us are the PhD candidates already. Under the chairmanship of Professor Mario Santiago de Carvalho. It has been held once a month on Zoom for over a year already, and usually involves all and only those who are granted access to this message and one special guest. Today's one is a special one because Professor Casalini, thank you so much for accepting our proposal of opening this seminar and even for the permit to record. Today, we invite Professor Casalini for this presentation entitled Cursus Conimbricensis, Jesuit Pedagogy and the Emergence of a Theory of Learning. And Professor Casalini is an associate professor and endowed chair in Jesuit Pedagogy and Educational History and research scholar with the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies at Boston College. He teaches their history of Jesuit pedagogy, social justice in Jesuit context, and philosophy of education. Boston College and University of Coimbra has some current collaboration going on with the portal Jesuit Studies with Conimbricenses.org. We have official collaboration in this online network. Today, we're gonna have Professor to present, and afterwards, we will have some time for Q&A session. Professor is okay. Can we even record that Q&A session?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I would like to pass the microphone to Professor Casalini. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ikeda. Thank you all for the invitation. And obviously, thanks to friend Mario for organizing such an important endeavor in the study of the Cursus Conimbricensis, something that I devoted a little bit of studies myself in the past. Okay, so it's really an honor for me to be here, also with I'm seeing a couple of doctoral students in our program at Boston College in formative education. And so I hope that we're going to spend an interesting hour or so in conversing about this important part of the history of Jesuit education, a product that has been extremely important in the development of what I keep calling Jesuit pedagogy. I will need Ikeda or whoever is the administrator of this room. I need to be co-host. I want to share with you a couple of slides. All right. And before going into that, because I don't like to see your faces disappearing from me and just facing a PowerPoint, which is always awkward. I want just to also say that whenever this is going to be a presentation with a Q&A, but anything that comes to mind and you want to chime in and interrupt you, please feel free. I hope to have this conversational meeting to be more seminar style than lecturing style. Okay, so if I'm co-host, I'm gonna share with you my screen, and it's all right. And all right, this is pretty blank, isn't it? All right. So, Cursus Conimbricensis, Jesuit Pedagogy and the Emergence of a Theory of Learning. So, before starting with my lecture, I have some warnings for you. I call this little title "Holzwege in Cursus," right? Not because I'm deluded that I think of myself as a new Martin Heidegger, obviously, but I think that this is a good expression to summarize my relation to the Cursus Conimbricensis, and particularly with Coimbra. As you know, I just worked on the Cursus a few years ago, and in this book that has been translated also in Portuguese. And when I was doing that, I basically tracked a few lines of potential research that in my mind remained as open questions, and they are still open questions to me today. So and the first epistemic warning that I want to give you is I'm in a session here with philosophers, right? I myself come from philosophy as history of philosophy as my original field, but I just moved away from that field and I progressively entered the concept of intellectual history of education. So what I was looking for in my trajectory, in my career, has been trying to find out the material conditions for the emergence of theories of learning and teaching, or philosophies of education, and particularly within the Jesuit context. So when I'm seeing you doctoral students right now, and I'm asking you about your project, your dissertation, I feel that you're going to have very specialized views on the cursus, and I hope you won't be disappointed by the approach that I'm going to take. But that's it. That's my epistemic trajectory that leads me to get to more practical issues of teaching, rather than discussing the real content, the ideal content of the cursus itself. So, Holzwege, at a glance, what I'm gonna tell you today is something around the practice of teaching, and what does the cursus probably responded to in the years when it was crafted. What was it meant to serve for, right? So it's basically, this is the same outline that I try to think about when I outlined my book, Aristotle in Coimbra. And basically this, the Cursus Conimbricensis is a product, right? A product that is meant for education. It emerged from educational needs, and it is intended for that. Finding out the material conditions for these needs and emergence not only has the meaning of deepening our understanding of what was going on the ground in schools and universities that the Jesuits ran in the early modern period, and not only that, also their global impact. But it means also to see whether material conditions of the practice of teaching might have had also an impact on developing a theory of education, developing a philosophy of education. This, as I said before, these are still open questions to me, and it requires finding out, really trying to have a better assessment of these results require the sort of research that for many years historians of philosophy haven't done much, relying upon the text itself, right? Thinking about the text, the printed text as a given. I'm not specifically mentioned the Cursus Conimbricensis. This goes for any other early modern philosopher. in other words, what I'm saying is doing history of philosophy when it comes to questions like this requires archival research, right? Requires expanding sources beyond the message that is delivered through the printed text. Something that I'm sure that you are already very, very acquainted with. So to make the first step, let me go back at the very origins. How did I meet the Cursus Conimbricenses in my research trajectory? I met it for the first time when I was editing a book by another Jesuit, Antonio Possevino, that is entitled De Cultura Ingeniorum, right, on the cultivation of talents. Now, this Cultura Ingeniorum was the introduction of Possevino's big book, gigantic book, right, called the Bibliotheca Selecta, which was published in 1593. The Bibliotheca Selecta was a big project by Possevino, who was not a faculty in a university. He was rather a humanist Jesuit with diplomatic interests in the end, someone who traveled basically half Europe and part of Russia, establishing schools, colleges, dealing with princes, rulers, and had some interesting story behind. But within this diplomatic and practical life, he also was a very prolific author in a variety of fields. One of the ideas that he had was to publish this Bibliotheca Selecta, which was basically a project that aimed to respond to other bibliothecae which have been had been published before from the Protestant side or also from other Catholic side. So what to suggest to a good Christian to have in his own library. That was the major concern of Possevino while writing the Bibliotheca Selecta, which turned out to be a monumental book with a lot of chapters that are not to be described as a list of bibliographical lists, but they are in fact important treatises on a variety of disciplines, including philosophy and including history and the like. Now, the introduction of that book is De Cultura Ingeniorum, which is in fact a treatise of what I call kind of philosophy of education, also history of education for other parts. That book responded, the cultura, the cultivation of talents, the title aimed to respond to the work of a Spanish physician, Juan Huarte de San Juan, which in the 70s of the 16th century published this book entitled Examen de Ingenios, so the examination of talents, right? The Examination of Talents was a book that aimed to blend Galenic temperamental and theory with the traditional psychology. So depending on what temperament somebody might have, that temperament will affect also what were considered as immaterial faculty of the mind, so intellect, memory, and imagination. And based on the temperament, this impact on the mind would have also been important to know in order for the prince, for example, to provide a specific specialized training and education to every single citizen based on their temperament, so to make the state machine work based on the fact that everybody was doing the job that they were born for. Okay, so this was the aim of the Examination of Talents, which basically had two pillars, pedagogical pillars. One, everybody is determined by nature in their own and in their body, and so it's some sort of materialism of nature. And the second, that the teaching, the education that this person needs to have is always specialized. You don't want to waste time in cultivating things that you are not born for. All right. So if you have great talent, there's no need to cultivate your memory because you will be always bad into that. Okay. So Possevino couldn't accept that, and because he's a Catholic, he's a Jesuit, and if you substitute nature with God, the theory of Juan Huarte de San Juan sounded too much similar to the Protestant theories of predestination, right? If you think that it's not nature that made me this way, but it is God, then I'm predestined because I'm my temperament affects my character. My character affects my moral decisions. My character affects also the powers of my mind and therefore my job. So everything in my life is basically determined, predetermined. The cultivation of talents by Possevino says yes, in part, and I'm just trying to make my argument very generic here to move away from it. Yes, you're right. We have all talents. We have all temperaments. That's correct. But God gave us free will to make use of it in our life, so we can actually counter the tendency by nature, the trends that we have, natural habits that we have by nature. In that case, by using three important things. One, our will to strive for something else, and second, finding great teachers that can help us learning something different or to behave differently, and great schools. Obviously, this was a programmatic celebration of Jesuit pedagogy, right? Possevino was particularly clear about that. Possevino, I'm thinking about the conversation that we had before starting the recording, had, on the contrary, a very, humanistic approach that quoted from Ficino, from Christian Kabbalah, and so some Platonic flavor that helped him being a particular Jesuit in his scenario. But in that book, and that's why I'm lingering on these things that apparently are disconnected with the Cursus Conimbricenses. In that book, he writes something that was important to me, and was my actually first encounter with the Jesuits. So the first thing that he mentions is a complaint that we will hear a lot from the Jesuits themselves in the first 50 years of Jesuit pedagogy. So he writes, he complains about a practice in the classroom. He complains about dictating lessons, right? He says those who focused more on dictating lessons to students rather than assessing them in the manner of ancient scholars fell into the trap of neglecting to cultivate talents. While students occupy themselves with coping and teachers simply recite from the written notes they carry, the disciplines fail to be transmitted through the living voice, voce viva, of the teacher, which according to St. Jerome has some sort of hidden energy to the ears of the students. This reliance on excessive writing causes numerous difficulties for students. Now, before moving on to in this long quote, let me mention this. For Possevino, dictation in classes is problematic because this doesn't help the cultivation of talents, right? So it's basically the biggest sin one can do against his idea of philosophy of education. So his book is entitled Cultivation of Talents. So dictating is against that. On the contrary, the living voice, Saint Jerome has energe, the concept of energeia that emerges from the written, the oral teaching of, and the free teaching of the instructor is essential component of education. This is something that we will find out, we will keep hearing from other Jesuits as well. What are these difficulties? The first difficulty for students is relying excessively on written materials rather than on genuine learning. as succinctly expressed in the proverb, if the paper falls, so does wisdom. Si carta cadat, sapientia vagat. Additionally, this reliance deprives masters and lecturers on the opportunity to address matters accurately. From such a source, one can imagine what kind of water might derive. And consequently, students not only neglect studying the best interpreters, but also, and most importantly, fail to carefully consider the text itself. As a result, they leave school satisfied with merely having someone take notes during lectures, which they either disregard entirely, or if they do glance at them, miss out on the valuable fruits gained through repetition, debate, and discussion. In essence, it's akin to scattering seeds on untilled and uncovered soil. Little can be expected in terms of fruitful outcomes. So here we have three major points that, to my mind, will echo also in every time we talk about the need for the Cursus Conimbricenses to be outlined, designed, and printed, right? The first thing is there is too much writing in the classroom. And this is, for Possevino, something that doesn't help also memorization, right? So you rely on your paper, the paper that your notebook that you wrote. And here I need to recommend you, if you are interested in this topic of note-taking and dictation, everything has been, I rely upon mostly is Paul Nell articles on this topic, as well as Anne Blair, who have been working on these specific aspects of education. But the second thing is that, and paradoxically, the dictation takes too much time in the classroom to let the teacher explain accurately, going in depth into the content of the lecture itself. So basically, you are spending too much time in dictating. There is less time to go deeper in the class, all right, and deeper in the lecture. Second, the third thing is important to note. If you dictate that much, says Possevino, you will neglect studying the best interpreters. So, to my mind, this quote sounds as if the dictation is relates to the dictation either of the text by Aristotle, I would say something about that, or the lecture that the teacher prepared for class. And this is something that it's the open question I will talk about a little bit. But something about going deeper into the interpreters, so the commentators, is lacking here. So no wonder, says Possevino, that students get bored of this and don't think that their actual physical presence is needed in the classroom. And they send people, that this was a practice that will go on and on, especially students with money will pay some scribes to go into the classroom taking notes instead of themselves. So they were basically they were learning on remote most of the time. And this is a testimony by Possevino that replies that actually testifies to that. But what for Possevino, what is the core of the class? What is the most important thing that we want our students to do in class? If you rely upon this dictation that happens out there, and perhaps it is dictated to someone, even to someone else, then you miss, and you don't go to class, you will miss the best part of it: repetition, debate, discussion. We can call these three exercises, all right? So Jesuit pedagogy, the most important essence of it, at least in the 16th century, is the relevance of exercising. And this goes well for both lower classes, grammar, humanities, and rhetoric, as well as philosophy. Obviously, the exercises are different in these two realms. You will have compositions in the most of the time as the written result of exercising in the lower schools, and you have disputations in philosophy classes. But with this general complaint by Possevino about dictation and this emphasis on the living voice of the teacher, the exemplarity of the teacher, and the importance of practical exercising, here we have finally the first reference to the college of to the Cursus of Conimbricensis. At least the first time that I met it in my trajectory. Possevino says, 2 hours who have dedicated themselves continuously to study and thus gain some understanding about this matter. Each passing day highlights the necessity of tempering such an effort. Students and teachers were exhausted by dictation, right? So everybody knows it. Everybody can see it every day, right? So to the glory of the giver of true wisdom, to the glory of God, our Portuguese fellows who are in the principal universities in Portugal, and to whom God granted great diligence in the good arts and disciplines, as well as in instructing the auditors, have admirably completed and printed a significant portion of the philosophy course, alleviating the burden of writing down. However, there still exist ample opportunities for diligent minds to further refine themselves and engage in exercise. Now, the Bibliotheca Selecta is printed in 1593. And we know that the first 2 phases, right, of the Cursus Conimbricenses is 1592, right, with the physics, and 93 with a little group of other writings. So for the philologist or for the specialist in Possevino, this is interesting because it seems to me that this introduction, this book, has been really written the last minute, just before going to print, because inevitably, if you say that the cursus has been largely printed, it means that not only physics was out when he wrote, but also the other books. The other books of 93 were out, and Bibliotheca was printed in 1593. So it means that really a short span of time when he can acknowledge that there's a short window of time when he can see that. But what interested me the most from this quote at the very origins was at the very origin of my trajectory was this idea that the Portuguese were granted with great diligence in the good arts and disciplines, right? Which I will say something about this later, basically told me about a Jesuit Portuguese taste for teaching disciplines that would eventually become editorial products, important not only in Portugal, but for the entire Society of Jesus, as manuals and compendia about every single discipline. Obviously, I'm thinking about Cipriano Soares Retórica, thinking about Alvarez Grammar, and I think also I can also think about Fonseca's Dialectics, right? This taste for creating their own material, their own textbook for classes, which is something that if you read Paul Grander and if you read other historian of early modern education or Renaissance education, you will find, or if you refer to Charles Schmidt, who wrote this chapter, The Rise of the Textbook, in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Renaissance philosophy, you will see as it important. The Jesuits sometimes would be criticized because they were using they started to use their own material to teach, reference to their own manuals to teach students. And this happened basically because they were unsatisfied with the material the manuals that they could have before. We will see something about this. But let's go back to this. The question is, here, our Conimbricenses wrote a book. They are entrusted with the most important universities and colleges, obviously, in Portugal, and they came out with a philosophy course, which is an extremely important element to reflect upon. to alleviate the burden on writing down. One step back here, these are writing down and dictating has been a long time problem issue for universities in general before the invention of printing, obviously, and for the Jesuits themselves. We know that the modus parisiensis was much relying upon the idea of exercising, and we know that the practice of dictating, which was widespread, was in fact not was in fact forbidden at a certain point in the 15th century. But then the reform by Cardinal d'Estouteville some sort of regulated it. It said it didn't forbid it anymore, but it said to limit this practice. The Jesuits themselves largely would complain and lament an excessive use of dictating in their classroom from the very beginning. But at the same time, those were the same Jesuits who were most of the time dictating themselves classes in their lectures, in their classes. And as we can see, for example, in these two cases that I just listed here, Adrian Loefius on Toletus in 1575, these Jesuits from Germany wrote to General Mercurian lamenting the fact that people were too much relying upon dictating the lecture, but at the same time, students were actually benefiting from this practice, right? Because before dictation, if these classes wouldn't be dictated, not everyone would be as fast enough as to take notes and to take them properly from the living voice of the teacher. And this is something that will come out as an important piece of dictating in the classroom. And the same goes for Sebastião Moraes or Morales, who was a Jesuit who visited the Roman College in 1578, lamenting and complaining about too much dictation happening in the classroom, but at the same time recognizing the fact that especially the slow-minded students, so to say, were helped by this system of dictating because first they could get the entire lecture clear, and second, they would understand it properly. All right. So a big concern of the Jesuits was also, again, pedagogical, content-based. The fact that students might take it wrongly, might misunderstood a class or a lecture of a teacher. And this obviously would cause a big problem in the case that these mistakenly understood lectures would spread out outside, especially when it came to contents that was subject to orthodoxy, right? So basically, the teacher would teach something that was, in his mind, orthodox. But if the students misunderstand it and take a note and make it unclear, and these students' notes go outside the college, and someone else, a Dominican, reads these notes, would complain, would say, well, you see, the Jesuits are heretics, right? This possibility was a major concern for the Society of Jesus throughout the first 50 years of their own inception. So much so that we can see as an important component, an important issue of the outlining of the Ratio Studiorum, right? You know that the Ratio Studiorum is a project, we can call it a plan of studies and a set of rules for the administration of schools and the pedagogy in there that was desired by the constitutions of the order, so very soon. And the need for this plan went on and on, was restated every time in the decades by every general until at least Father Acquaviva, Claudio Acquaviva, who in fact took it very seriously and established a commission, a committee to outline and start officially the process that would lead to the Ratio Studiorum that we know today, 1599, right? Some versions, interim version of this Ratio Studiorum were released. One of them was in 1586, right? So this commission that had been established by Claudio Acquaviva worked a draft, actually a couple of drafts, A and B, they are called now. And these drafts were sent out to the provinces and assistances to get feedback from the Jesuits on the ground. It's important to note that the Ratio Studiorum is never a top-down approach document, but it's always relying upon a feedback-centered periphery, right? It's a long process of collective discernment, so to say. So what comes back from the Portuguese province in 1586 about a point of dictation? Mind these things. Dictation was widely used in lower classes and had no problems. In that dictation, most of the time, we refer to dictating grammar rules or rhetorical figures and something like that. So this was clear. When it comes to philosophy and theology, though, dictation becomes a problem, much more a problem, as we saw, especially because time is taken from disputing, from exercising. And so, for example, dictation in theology would be problematic. Philosophy was a middle ground, right? As we see in this feedback that the Jesuit from Portugal sent back to Rome, he says, at this point, hoc rerum statum, we don't want dictation to be removed from the practice of teaching. Hoc rerum status, it means that until we get, until commentaria in Aristotelem, quae in hac provincia iussu reverenti padres generalis conscribuntur in lucem extra. Until we get our commentaries out, it's okay for us to keep dictating, all right? Especially, says, because there is some freedom that needs to be allowed for the teachers of philosophy, quae proprio Marte invenerint in super annotare et propria stradere observationes. So, quae proprio Marte invenerint. So there are teachers who, in fact, rely upon their own mind, their own invention, right? The Latin concept of inventio, their own findings, their own teaching. This of dictating allows them to prepare classes and dictate them, right? And so until we don't have a cursus, until we have a commentary that is out there and published, it's okay to go on with this dictation. Now, the rules for the final Ratio Studiorum in 1599 will take this approach. So if anyone, without going as far as dictating, can teach in such a way that the students can easily get whatever ought to be written down, then it is desirable that he not dictate. Certainly, teachers should dictate only in such a way that they do not pause after each word, but generally in one breath. And there is good reason. They should repeat in just so many words. And they should not dictate the entire question and then explain it, but they should repeatedly dictate it and explain it in turn. So this quote is referring to, and I'm trying to accelerate right now because I'm cognizant that I'm losing too much time here. dictation happened in two ways. And in fact, the reform of Cardinal de Stouteville in Paris referred to both of them. One way was dictating word by word, the verbo ad verbum, which basically was based on a reading that was completely meaningless. So if you were to cope this dictation, you wouldn't have gotten the sense of the sentence that had been dictated, right? So the ratio studiorum says, don't do that. Try to, if you dictate, fine, but if you dictate, at least try to dictate with a pace that is doable for a student to follow it and understand the meaning of what you are dictating while is noting them down, right? Moreover, not only that, but when you are dictating, what are you dictating? This is the question that I was trying to find out, and it's still an open question about the Cursus Conimbricensis, for me at least, until further archival research is done, and you're certainly a better position than me being in Coimbra to do that. What was dictated? The ratio studiorum says, not the question and explain it, right? So it seems from this quote that the object of dictation was not merely the text, Aristotelian text, which I think Paul Nell alluded in his original articles, but also the questions and the explanation, right? And he says, the ratio studiorum says, don't dictate the questions and then the explanation, but try to dictate the question while explaining it too. So there was kind of an idea of blending the mechanical device of dictating while the explanation would go. So the only thing is, I want to tell you about today is the fact that it seemed to me when I looked at Possevino that the idea of dictating was meaningful in an age when the printing was not there. Therefore, a student should have gotten the text of Aristotelian text to understand what was the commentary about. But in fact, and possibly when with the printing on, this practice would disappear. But that's not the case. The practice of dictating kept existing throughout early modern times, even with books that had been printed, commentaria and something like that, including the cursus. So the question to me remains about since the cursus was expected as to solve the issue of dictating, was it successful in that? And what kind of dictation did it avoid? Here is a quote by Jouvency from 1703. Anything is dictated in class, it should be both brief and necessary. We still have a testimony that dictation somehow is going on in the classroom. Now, back 1592. This is the imprimatur by Fonseca that I'm sure that you are acquainted with on the books on physics. He says, for a long while now, many were hoping that there be a review, extension, enrichment of those common rules, philosophical commentaries and in a handwritten form that were dictated, involving the daily effort of those noting them down in the Coimbra Academy of Liberal Arts, college actually, entrusted to our society. Right, so Fonseca, who had so much important role in the development of the Cursus Conimbricensis, and not getting into that story, refers to this as the major reason, right, to build a cursus, to create the Cursus Conimbricensis, that of relieving a practice, something in the practice. So there is a material condition we want to address by assembling this course, okay? And this is the end of the quote. Well, probably I will give you this presentation if you want to keep it on for your record, and you can use the translation whenever you want. Okay. So, Emmanuel, you are working on ethics, right? So this is a quote that you surely know. Also, Antonio Manuel Martins, upon whom I'm also relying when reflecting on these things, highlighted this passage, what was dictated? That was my question, right? Is the Aristotelian text that is dictated? Is the explanatio? Is the quaestio? What is exactly dictated in the classroom? Because if the Cursus Conimbricensis is published as to avoid the dictation, so how does the classroom look like? How does the lecture look like? What are we dictating? The Aristotelian text doesn't seem so when it comes to ethics. True, the pedagogy of ethics is different. It takes much less time than physics. It evolves in a different ways. It's all different. But certainly the ethics are questions, right? So we cannot say that ethics is that in Coimbra was the text of Aristotle, the ethics of Aristotle was dictated based on the cursus, because the cursus doesn't have it, right? It provides some questions about that. And so this is a quote from Antonio Manuel Martins, who has studied everything would have begun. I mean, the cursus was intended in this way that two principal strategic goals would be reached: to significantly alter the teaching and learning process by putting the emphasis on assimilation of contents through the more active methods of interpretation and the discussion of themes, and second, to guarantee with more efficacy the doctrinal unity, in the sense of excluding preliminarily what has been judged incompatible with church doctrine. I believe that this thesis by Antonio Manuel Martins holds very well still. So the cursus was intended as to alleviate the burden of dictating, which meant by having the cursus, our students will be able to spend much more time on disputing and exercising than in writing notes down. And the second, if you have a notebook, if you have a manual, if you have the book, it goes the same as what Lefeus said about Toletus in Germany. So we have a book, and we can refer to that book as not to dictate, so the students will exercise and students will not get it wrong, which means by having an approved manual, an approved textbook, we also can secure the orthodoxy of our teaching. If that is approved, the students will get it wrong. We are not also teaching something that is ambiguous in terms of doctrinal issues. And I think this is the major material condition for the emergence of the Cursus Conimbricensis in terms of a product for learning. Again, thinking about 1593, I already said that Possevino is publishing the Bibliotheca Selecta, and we have two phases so the cursus is out there, but something more important is happening for the Society of Jesus from November to the early period in 1594. There is General Congregation number 5. Claudio Acquaviva, he is forced to convene a general congregation that has not to elect a new superior general, which is the first case. There are very few in the history of the Society of Jesus. He is forced to convene it because there is the Memorialistas controversy. So Spanish Jesuits, and not only Spanish, who complain about his style of government, centralized. So this is something that the Spanish province was not happy with the centralization by Acquaviva's style of governing. It's convened to address the limpieza de sangre policy, so something shameful for the Society of Jesus of the time. So whether to accept whether to accept as member of the religious order people with converso ancestry, so people with Jewish ancestry, or Saracen, as the word in the in the proceedings of the in the acts of the General Congregation said. so there is a lot of tension within the Society of Jesus itself, political tensions that deal with organization and admissions, but there is still a little bit of tension about the Ratio Studiorum. We saw 1586 first two drafts. A new draft is outlined in 1591. And what we know about the Ratio Studiorum today is the fact that the Ratio Studiorum is a set of rules, right? 1599 is in fact a set of rules, an administrative book, but the most important part of it was in fact dismissed. In 1591, the most important part of the Ratio Studiorum for general Aquaviva was part number 1 that dealt with the uniformity of doctrine. So something that Aquaviva wanted the Society of Jesus to be very cognizant of, since the society was under pressure from inside and from outside. People, the fighting with the Dominicans on Molinism, you know, or all sorts of accusation to the Society of Jesus of crypto-Protestantism or anything like that. If you read O'Malley, you have the entire list of accusations that they were normally have to deal with. And therefore, the last thing that the general wanted to have was that Jesuits spread across the globe teaching philosophy would have taught something that was accused of being heretic or heterodox, right? So how to safeguard the Society of Jesus from these dangers? We need to find a way to have a uniformity of doctrine, right? Solid and uniform, it says, safe and sound. How to do that? The idea surfaced of having a list of propositions or a list of elements that every Jesuit should have been approved, and every Jesuit should have been taught. First part of the Ratio Studiorum was intended as to address this issue in 1591. Now, the result, and I'm trying to squeeze my argument because I'm cognizant that I'm really going too long into this part, is these propositions were in fact more controversial than expected. Obviously, and this is something I wrote in my book on Aristotle and Coimbra that I know that Mario liked. So Aristotle was the authority, sure, but what is Aristotle in the 16th century? Is a set of doctrines, or is much more a lexicon, a toolbox? Are we, when philosophizing, are we philosophizing on Aristotle or through Aristotle? I believe it's much more the second one, right? Aristotle is a jargon that we need to work on, and certainly we want to interpret, but at the same time, Aristotle is the prism through which philosophers could enter, could speculate, okay? Therefore, it's obvious that it deals with interpretations, and these interpretations can be conflictual, inevitably conflictual, right? So a list of proposition was in the end much more controversial than the absence of it. When it comes to 1593, the congregation, a committee is established within the congregation, presided by Bellarmine, and say, what do we do with this Ratio Studiorum? They come out with a few rules, but if I can squeeze their argument, the concept is this: we need to stick to what the Constitution said. The Constitution says, follow Aquinas, follow Aristotle, and that's it. We don't want to get into the details of what it means, right? Whereas the second part, so we can dismiss the commentariolus, we can dismiss the first part. Don't deal with that, because it's much more trouble than that of fixing it. So the second part, the Ratio Studiorum that we know, so the rules for administrating, that can go, that can be published, and that can be experimented, tried on the ground, and we will see about this. Now, this is happening in 1593. We know that the Ratio Studiorum will recommend Alvarez grammar, Soares rhetoric. There is also some suggestions in this temporary versions of the ratio about Fonseca's dialectics, but there's no cursus in that, right? And my sense is that the cursus eventually was not included because it comes at the wrong moment, paradoxically. In 1593, the congregation is discussing about dismissing the entire idea of having a set of rules. And here we have a much needed and hoped for cursus, which was a set of doctrines in the end, right? The cursus is not merely, an encyclopedical. There are some theories in there, and so we couldn't. I believe that at that time couldn't be perceived as an object binding all the Jesuits to some doctrines rather than others. All right. So this is probably why I believe it never came through as the sources would say. Every source is hoping for this cursus to happen. Eventually, this cursus happened, but the Ratio Studiorum doesn't require the Jesuit to teach it. So something has happened in between. We know that in the 17th century, the uniformity of doctrine would be pursued by generals in the other way around, not of that of proposing propositions, but that like the Ordinatio by Piccolomini, forbidding Jesuits to teach some dangerous doctrines and some sort of proposition. All right, the cursus stuck in the middle there. It's a body of doctrines, and in 1593, probably it was not the time for the Jesuits to process or accept it as the binding textbook. So first, Altzweck. What was really dictated in a Jesuit classroom? How did the class really look like during the time? How was the cursus eventually used in Coimbra and abroad? Because to me, this could sound as a potential and a curious potential outcome that of, okay, the dictation was not merely about Aristotelian text. Dictation could have been related to explanations and questions. My question is, provided that a commentary was a big book and the cost of a book are not, it's not cheap in that time. And yes, there is a typography, there is a printer in Coimbra, but my question is about who's actually using those books. Are students all allowed to have a copy of this book, or is the college that has a book and everybody can, there are rules. Paul Nell describes how to use a book in a library with notes, no notes, all this sort of thing. But I'm still very intrigued by understanding and learning, and probably maybe you have more recent research that I wasn't able to find out that might explain something about this. I think that there is a need for archival research on this, finding the manuscript, these notes, comparing them, and try to find out whether the cursus was adopted as a given. So the teachers would refer to the book and move on to exercise students, or in fact would take the cursus and dictate questions from the cursus. So the paradox that I'm mentioning here is that, well, perhaps there is a chance that the Cursus Conimbricensis was actually dictated, which would be very curious, right? If the full product, if the product was meant as to alleviate dictation, it would be curious for it to be dictated as well. We have just a qualifier by Descartes, in a letter to Mersenne. It's famous. I'm sure that you know about that. He refers to the Jesuit philosophical, to the cursus, as a prolix one. He marks that as for its prolixity. It's very long and boring, right? It seems to me that he referred in that sense, he was able to have the book itself rather than being dictated, but this doesn't really solve my issue. So one potential, moving on, at least in my research, at least if you guys invite me in Coimbra to do archival research, I will happily say yes. I would be curious about going into the archives and try to find notes and this actual notes that can solve this issue. I know that there are scholars like my friend Anna Tropia, but also other Paula Silva, Joao Rebalde. They have been working on manuscripts like that. Mario refers to this manuscript, particularly this one, 2399, attributed to Fonseca and the Anima. So there are manuscripts that have been, historians are starting to work very closely and to check on manuscripts alike. But I think this is much important. So an hour has passed, and I'm trying to squeeze the other two arguments at this point. Another element that I found it important to outline the relevance of the Cursus Conimbricensis for the development of a theory of learning in Jesuit pedagogy is the fact its nature as a textbook, right? And certainly we are talking about the commentaries, and we are going into, it's known that in the 17th century manuals will come in, right? From the medieval commentaries, though, to the Renaissance translation of Aristotle, there is plenty of research on that. There is some research on what is the text and what is the translation that is adopted in the Cursus Conimbricenses, right? Argyropoulos, etc., in the Cursus. But there are also commentaries that along the way, and I'm thinking about the research that has been done by Marco Forlivesi particularly, that are called commentaries or cursus ad mentem Scotti, ad mentem Aquinas, so commentaries and cursus that are addressing questions that evidently were not addressed by the author itself, but teachers, current authors can deal with ad mentem, right? As if inspired by. So this idea of the toolbox that I was mentioning to you before comes back very clearly in the titles that we are mentioning here. Certainly there is a tradition, a recent tradition, and there are some authors among the Jesuits who stand very, who are milestones in this transition for the medieval commentary to the manuals, right? To the early modern manuals. And Bennett Pereira's the Omnium Communium Principis is a clear example of reassembling the questionings and the topics in the order that Aristotle didn't think about, and treating them from the order of doctrine that Pereira himself found it more expedient. It's something that is mirrored by, obviously, by Suarez's Disputationes Metaphysicae. And obviously this is another milestone in that transition. So we start with Aristotle, we start with the order of Aristotle, and then here we have some Jesuits deconstructing the order of these disciplines and this doctrine, reassembling the questions according to a rational order. The Jesuit commentaries, the Cursus Conimbricenses, stands really in this transition. And again, I'm thinking about the ethics, right? It's the same title as Suarez in the end. So we have the Disputationes. We have an order that is different. So we have an educational product that is intended for education, that has, according to the Constitution, to follow Aristotle, that in fact somehow deconstruct and rebuild already. All right. There is certainly a major concern about following the order. The Physica is more that, but there are also elements that in the cursus that are really speaking about a different order of treating things. And this is very clear in Coto's dialectic. And as complained Antonio Manuel is that there is still people that address this, still historians that address today the Conimbricenses, the Cursus Conimbricensis as medieval commentaries, but there's no ground for it. In fact, they are very different. And I agree with him. I agree very much with him in this sense that we can see the movements of something that is really taking shape in the history of education, at least not only in Europe, obviously, because of the impact of the cursus, a global impact, but in fact that has, there is a transitional relevance of I would say the author, but certainly Gois would disagree with me, not the author, but today's way, our ways of addressing topics in the times of Gois are cognizant of something that is changing in the order. All right. So this is why I'm thinking about a programmatic disorder. And there are also some Holzwege here. How can we really, we really need to find out and keep digging into a product that in fact is a collective product, right? We know that all sorts, we know of Goisch and Couto, and perhaps it's different in the case of Alvarez, but these are editors in the end, right? Not only authors, particularly editors. So the material here is something that is and wants to show itself as a collective endeavor, and therefore our first issue is to find out whether there is a uniform doctrine within the text itself, right? Or rather, there are nuances that we can track or be cognizant about. When I'm putting disorder, is I don't want to linger onto this because the time is almost done. But you know what I'm referring to. Obviously, technically, they should have started with the dialectic. They started with physics, and the dialectic came out 1606, only after the forgery. No metaphysics, and this is a big issue that involves assessing the relation between the Cursus and the Fonseca that has been studied very much. There is a book by Mario, edited by Mario and Simone, and still very much has to be understood about this relation, particularly in the absence of Fonseca from let's say in the not so much relevant impact of Fonseca in the references that are made in the cursus, as much as we could expect of. And so finding out what has happened in that time, the material conditions for the Cursus Conimbricenses, which include personal aspects. I know that Antonio is not keen on Antonio Manuel Martins is not keen on getting into that, but certainly the relations between people at the college or in the province, in the Portuguese province, must have had played a role in how the cursus was eventually constructed. So the last thing I want to say is actually, if all these material conditions for the publication of the cursus were important to shape it as the product that it is, which means a book that is intended to alleviate from dictating, a commentary that is intended as to start reframing the order of questions and possibly, serve as a status of the art for certain questions. A book that would become an example and compelling textbook for many other Jesuit schools, no matter whether the ratio would require it or not, right? All these elements are extra textual. The question remains where the authors, or are there any places within the cursus itself where we can find elements of an educational theory that reflect these material conditions. So in other words, were they aware theoretically, did they care at all theoretically about the relevance of the educational setting that their product was intended for? Okay. In other words, can we find the philosophy of education in the Cursus Conimbricensis? Okay. An explicit philosophy of education. Now, very shortly here, I was much more positive when I started, and I wrote I wrote the book, and I was fascinated, especially by Couto's commentary on the line of the second analytics, right? Omnis doctrina disciplina ex antecedente cognizione fit, right? Which was a fascinating journey into this point that he makes, that basically you always need a teacher providing a signum to you. That's the starting point, which means a social beginning of knowledge, right? Which means education stands, but this is a this is clearly a retrojection by a philosopher today, right? It's a stretch. There is always the need for a human teacher to indicate you a signum, which is something that is really resonant, echoing with Augustine de Magistro. We start with a human gesture, so you can't get out of this social background of the origins of knowledge unless you really, you do like Possevino, that you adopt another approach, which is in fact based on Christian Kabbalah and Neoplatonism in a way. But except for this, except for the commentaries that we can find in Couto's Dialectics, except for a few questions that I believe we can find in the De Anima, and a few things that, especially with regard to the order of doctrine and discipline, we start to find in the Physics. There are no other indications of an explicit philosophy of education coming through the cursus, to my knowledge today. On the contrary, you see Pereira as a philosopher of education. He wrote a lot about that explicitly, and not only in his De Principiis, but also in documents and courses and letters that I contributed to also to edit and publish with my colleague Christoph Sander in a way, and Fonseca did as well, for example. So we have all these examples that we can find of Jesuits dealing with philosophy of education in a more explicit way. And obviously we have with the Jesuits we started with, Antonio Possevino. Antonio Possevino in that book is explicit in outlining the need for a theory of education that is not theory as disengaged with the practice. So he clearly designed a philosophy of education that it's much more difficult to find explicitly or solidly as such in the Cursus Conimbricensis. Having said that, though, certainly certainly. The Cursus Conimbricenses is an essential milestone in the history not only of Jesuit pedagogy, but in the history of early modern philosophy education. Its impact has been, tracked for a long while, geographically and diachronically, and I'm pretty sure that this material contextual framework for its design and publication possibly played a role also in how to assemble the opinions that eventually were eventually outlined in the final publication. So I think it's an hour and 15. I think I would stop here, and glad to have a chat with you about this.
Professor Casalini, thank you so much for sharing this profound insight on this very interesting issue on pedagogy and theory of learning. Theory of learning in the end of the medieval time. Now, I would like to open this seminar for question and answer session. If any of you has a question to ask to Professor Casalini about today's presentation, please simply raise your hand or hit the raising hand sign on Zoom.